Good morning, church.
Good morning.
It is so good to be here. I am so honored to fill your pulpit this morning and bring you some of my thoughts and understandings of the passages that we heard. I want to thank Pastor Pat for inviting me here this morning. And I want to bring you greetings from my home church, Spring Glen Congregational Church in Hamden, Connecticut, where I am a member with my husband and one of my children and two of my grandchildren. I have had this social justice preaching ministry while doing other things on and off since 2012. And you are church number 171. Not that I'm counting. But now that we're the Southern New England Conference, there are 600 churches, so I have a ways to go. Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. You know, when Pastor Pat and I were in conversation about my visit this morning, she mentioned that today, September 17th, is Constitution Day. I had no idea. After all, Hallmark had not made any kind of a special card about it, so I was clueless. But I got to thinking about our Constitution of the United States. It's a Constitution that has been interpreted and reinterpreted many times over. I would guess that hundreds of books have been written about it. Every law school has at least one constitutional scholar on its faculty. It's a very complex document. But I thought I would take a look at it once again, at the preamble, the first part of the Constitution that clearly states out its goals. And it says this: we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. Wow! Establish justice, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. You know, that's us, the posterity. Those are goals that I can really get behind. And while I was on a roll with this Constitution theme, I thought I'd take a look at the United Church of Christ's Constitution. And here's an excerpt from it. The UCC Board shall encourage the church in all its expressions to speak prophetically on matters of justice, power, and public policy. The UCC Board shall assist the church in all its expressions to confront injustice and alienation in the church and in society. The UCC Board shall provide support for the church's ministries of service and on behalf of those who are poor, the forgotten, and the oppressed, and those who are marginalized. Close quote. It is remarkable to me that we have these documents, each of which would lead us to the kind of compassionate caring and concern for one another that is at the heart of being a follower of Christ. And we have a scripture telling us, this morning we heard it read, speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of the destitute. Speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. And so here I am, following the guidance of the U.S. Constitution and the United Church of Christ's Constitution and Holy Scripture to talk about where we can find injustice alive and well and living among us in our communities and in our state and in our nation. And my particular topic this morning is systemic racism. You know, some folks believe that we should be beyond talking about racism in this country, But as long as it exists, I think people of good conscience need to talk about it. Recently, I read an op-ed in the New York Times by David French that put it into context for me. He wrote this: "One of the most important realities of American life is this: no nation can fully undo the effects of 345 years of state-sanctioned bigotry, from slavery to Jim Crow, in 59 years. The time period between the arrival of the first enslaved people on the colonial shores in 1619 and the abolition of legalized discrimination with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is simply too long, the discrimination too ingrained, and the distortion of society too great to wave the magic wand of legal and cultural reform and quickly realize the dream of American equality." Close quote. So true. And so today we will talk about racism. In the final chapter of the Gospel of Matthew that we heard read this morning, we heard Jesus' answer to a young Pharisee who questioned about the greatest commandment. And Jesus said that we are to love God with all our hearts, with all our souls, and with all our minds, and that we must love our neighbors as ourselves. He said essentially that you don't even need to worry about all those laws in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. We don't need to worry about the 10 Commandments. We don't need to worry about all the lessons of the prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos and Micah and all those others. We don't need to worry about the lessons that they teach. All we need to do is love God and love one another. All we need to do is love God by loving one another. That we don't need to worry about the do not steal or the do not bear false witness against one another or the do not commit adultery commandments and all the others if we love the people from whom we might steal, if we love the people who we might tell lies about, if we love the people who would be hurt if we commit adultery. That if we love one another, all the other rules and regulations take care of themselves. Love God and love one another. If Jesus Christ had a constitution for us all to live by, it couldn't do better than these 6 words: love God and love one another. Now, you need to know that Jesus is not talking about the mushy kind of love, of romance, or the brotherly, sisterly love that we feel for our siblings and our friends. No, Jesus is talking about agape love, the kind of love that God has for us. Wishing the best for each other's lives. We don't even need to like a person. It's to want them to be happy and fulfilled in their lives, to love them with agape love. We just need to work to help assure that they can flourish in life. Jesus broke it down for us. On this, he said, hang all of the law and all of the prophets. The Apostle Paul that we heard read this morning reiterated it in his letter to the Romans when he wrote, "Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is fulfilling the law." So, given that as a foundation, let's talk about what fulfilling the law might look like. Lately there's been much hubbub over CRT, critical race theory. So many people are rabidly against CRT, and I find that the people who are the most against it have no idea what it is. And just so that you and I are on the same page, let me share with you a definition of critical race theory. This is a quote from Stephen Sawchuk in Education Week magazine. He writes, and I quote, "Critical race theory is an academic concept that is more than 40 years old. The core idea is that race is a social construct and that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but also something embedded in society's systems and policies and practices. Close quote. And by the way, that is not what anyone is teaching in public schools. What is being taught in public schools is history. Hopefully a truer, more inclusive history than perhaps you and I experienced when we were in school, but it is history nonetheless. There have been efforts in some states to prevent teaching a more inclusive American history in public schools, in public colleges. They want to assure that CRT is not being taught because CRT has become the issue of the day for this decade's racism rallying cry. Many white parents are up in arms about the teaching of African American history as part of the story of our nation in public schools, K through 12, even to top students in AP classes. And these people say, well, they say that children will be made to feel bad, ashamed of their race, or uncomfortable about learning that our founding fathers were human beings with all the biases that go along with being human. That they were indeed driven by high-minded ideas of democracy and self-government, but that they also may have been driven by a desire to hold on to wealth and power. These people who rail against that boogeyman, CRT, don't want children to learn these things. They don't want children to feel bad. Now, there's one thing from their assumptions that's missing about the children who might be taught about racism. Because in all of these discussions, when the children that are imagined feeling bad are mentioned, it's from the point of view of the white kids, right? They can't see that the children of color, the black kids, they're also in those classrooms, but they can't see them there. Their point of view does not matter. And no one should be invisible in the beloved community of Christ, a community where neighbors are loving neighbors. Might the black child feel bad about her race if we leave out the reason that's behind her experience of racism that most black children experience by 5 years old? And that the reason does not point to something wrong with them? Isn't the notion that somehow white children should be protected from ever feeling bad at the expense of black children being made to feel bad all the time and internalizing society's view of them? Isn't that just another form of white supremacy? Seems like a lack of love for those little black neighbors. And what did Jesus say? Love God and love neighbor. Everything else will take care of itself. You know, last year I read a post on Facebook where a 9-year-old white girl was asked how she felt about reading the children's version of the 1619 Project. On that reading list that Pastor Pat spoke about, and I hope you'll pick one up before you leave. Oh, yes, great. This adult's version of the 1619 Project is on that, and I do commend it to your reading. But she was asked how she felt about reading the children's version that many parents are trying to ban from school curriculum. And this was her answer. She said, I think the only white people who feel bad or mad or uncomfortable about reading the stuff that white people did in history are the people who want to do it again. Close quote. Out of the mouths of babes, right? Oh my gosh. Don't you love her? Seeking to understand critical race theory rather than vilifying it is a step that we Christians need to take if we hope to love one another as Jesus would have us love. There is systemic racism in our communities, in our state, in our nation. And as the Christian nation that so many people claim we are, we have not been doing whatever we could to end the injustice of systemic racism. We've been okay with the injustice that has created and continues to maintain totally segregated communities in America. The fact is that Americans are living in more segregated communities today than in the 1960s, when the civil rights movement was going strong. And this is not because people of color, especially black folk, have chosen to live with people who look like us. No, this is because of the deliberate segregation of our nation by the federal government, redlining. And I provided you with that list. Another book on that list is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. I thought I understood redlining. I didn't know the half of it. Read that book. That redlining has put a big red target on black communities where the government doesn't provide the same services that other communities, predominantly white ones, take for granted. It lets appraisal systems know where to undervalue homes and whose homes to undervalue. That systemic racism in home ownership continues today, even when a black family has a home in a predominantly white community. Systemic racism is at play. Let me share with you an example of the kind of systemic racism that I read about last year in the New York Times. Seems that last summer, Nathan Connolly, a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and his wife had their house in Baltimore reappraised because they wanted to refinance for a mortgage, lower rates, what we all do. They believed that their house, improved with renovations of $40,000, a little different, was worth more than the $450,000 than they had paid for the house in 2017. But a Maryland appraisal company put the home's value at $472,000. Now, they knew how much houses in their neighborhood were selling for, and they knew that that was significantly undervalued. So they chose not to refinance at that time. Months later, they decided to try again with a different bank, and this time they got more creative. They removed all of their family photos, all of their children's drawings of figures with dark skin. They took down their poster of the Black Panther movie and put away all of their literature by black authors, anything that would signal that the house was owned by black people. And they had a white male colleague, another professor from Johns Hopkins, to stand in for them. And the second appraisal valued the house at, well, you tell me, what do you think? $550. $600. $750. You must have read the whole thing or heard it on NPR like I did, right? $750,000. Some difference, right? As I have talked with and listened to lots of white people about systemic racism over these past couple of years that I've been preaching on this topic, I've discovered that many don't even know what we mean when we say systemic racism. It's like we're living in neighborhoods so distant from one another that we cannot see what some of our black siblings have to deal with every day. So I thought I would provide a definition of systemic racism as well. This comes from a journal article on health disparities by Paula Braverman and some other people, and they write this in definition. Systemic and structural racism are forms of racism that are pervasively and deeply embedded in systems, laws, written and unwritten policies, and entrenched practices and beliefs that produce, condone, and perpetuate widespread unfair treatment and oppression of people of color with adverse consequences. Close quote. So our appraisal example shows racism baked into the systems that appraisers use, that they're using today. It's white supremacy baked in. Heather McGhee, in her book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, another book on your list, she estimates that there is $68 billion worth of lost wealth for black homeowners because of this example of systemic racism that results in white supremacy. You know, these systems and structures are so intertwined that systemic racism just continues without any actual card-carrying racists fueling it. As I thought about the ways that systemic racism impacts the lived lives of real people, people whom Jesus would have us love, I wondered about the fact that the median annual income of black Americans is $24,000, while the median annual income of white Americans is $188,000. There are lots and lots of reasons, many of them caused by systemic racism, to explain this ridiculous disparity. So let me share another example of systemic racism that provides just one small contribution to that disparity. Let's talk about black farmers. The United States Department of Agriculture has been doing injustice for decades to black people who want to farm. Data shows that black farmers have been denied loans from the Department of Agriculture at a rate twice as high as white farmers. And if you know anything about farming, you know that getting a loan in order to plant your fields is absolutely essential. Due to this ongoing systemic racism, about $326 billion worth of farmland has been lost by black farmers during the 20th century, according to the first study to quantify that loss. And that land loss was due to discriminatory lending practices of the Department of Agriculture and forced sales of those black farmers' lands. Systemic racism. You know, for me, the infuriating thing about knowing this stuff is that when anyone tries to fix it, folks yell, "Reverse discrimination." The Biden administration tried to make loans to black farmers who had been the victims of systemic racism all these decades, but had to pull back because of the white farmers complaining, essentially complaining that they were no longer benefiting from the unfairness of the system. It's only in knowing these things that we can hope to do anything about it. In order to lift our voices about the areas where systemic racism still reigns, we have to know about it, right? Here's another example. I promise it's the last. I just heard this one a few months ago on NPR on Sunday morning. In the sugarcane fields in Florida, part of the harvesting process includes burning the fields to get rid of the straw that surrounds the inner cane. Now, in Brazil, where most of the world's sugar comes from, they no longer burn fields because of the air pollution that the burning produces and the health risks to the people in the area. Seems that they care for those people. They've developed another way to harvest sugarcane that does not involve burning. But in Florida, the sugarcane companies continue to burn, and most of the resulting smoke blows over communities in the glades. Those communities are filled with mostly black and brown people. There is even a ban on burning when the smoke changes direction and blows east toward the wealthier, whiter communities like West Palm Beach. Cane burning is banned if it will make wealthy white people sick, but it's deemed perfectly okay when blowing over communities of color, where the incidences of various lung diseases affect almost every family. Systemic racism, right? I bet those sugarcane executives in Florida would not think of themselves as racist, but their disdain for poorer, blacker Americans results in racism, right? You know, first we saw the battle against CRT and true history, and now those same forces are moving to destroy DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. They have made being woke or aware of the injustice of our nation a bad thing. I think being aware of the injustice in our nation, in other words, being woke, is a good thing, but they've made it bad. But now the targets of racism, well, the targets of hatred have grown to include more and more categories of people. Black people, brown people, Asian people, Jewish people, LGBTQ people, all people who represent the other, whom Jesus would have us love. You know, as I go from place to place, I find that many churches believe they are doing justice, when what they are really doing is charity. Now, charity is certainly needed, but when combating poverty, it does not go far enough. Let me tell you a story. This story is usually attributed to Saul Alinsky, but nobody can say for sure if he ever actually wrote it, but I'm giving him credit. It illustrates the difference between charity and justice. There was once a town with a river running through it, and one day a stranger came along and found all the town people outside in a line going all the way down to the river. So this stranger walked down to the river to see what was going on. And what he saw was a bunch of little babies floating down the river. He asked one of the townfolk what was happening, and he was told that the whole town had mobilized to rescue the babies from the river. They would pluck them out and hand them up to the people waiting to catch them and convey them to safety. You would think that the stranger would pitch in to help. But no, he started running upstream to see what was going on. And when the town folk saw him running away, they said, wait, where are you going? We need your help. And he said, I'm going upriver to see who keeps throwing them in. Plucking babies out of the river, that's charity. Doing something about who's throwing them in, that's justice. Being a disciple of Jesus means loving others by doing both charity and justice. If we intend to be true followers of Jesus Christ, then we need to do more than put up a sign. We need to do more than listen to the news of the nation and become so sad about it that we stop believing that we can do anything about it, and we just sit in our sadness. What we need is for people to educate themselves about a fulsome American history, a history that explains how we got to this place of systemic racism, hidden in the systems and structures of America. What we need is for folks, white folks and brown folks and black folks, working together to find ways to end systemic racism in our communities. What we need is for folks to love God by loving one another enough to partner with God in the creating of the beloved community where love reigns and hate has no place. We need to live into the Constitution of Christ, to love God and love one another. As 20th century prophet John Lennon once wrote, all we need is love. Amen. And now listen to this benediction from St. Francis of Assisi. May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and turn their pain into joy. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in the world, so that you can do what others claim cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to all God's people. Go now to love and serve the Lord.